Hello, Mike Hako. Good morning. Can you hear me okay back there?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to talk about this notion of ancient wisdom, future thinking, with a subtext saying raising the blue continent, which is really about raising a new consciousness, hopefully, as we enter the new century with new challenges and opportunities. I'd like to preface my remarks first by drawing your attention to what we refer to as kanoho panihakahaka, the empty chair. There really is never empty. I'm going to ask each of you to think about those that you are accountable to, because that's what that chair represents. Those that have no voice, those that may not be here, those that we represent. We ask that before we speak, before we act, that we consider our ancestors who sit in that chair, the descendants that will come in the future that sit in that chair, the whales, the trees, the nature that feeds them and us. This is who is in this empty chair. So as we speak today and we share, please consider who it is that you are accountable to and who is in your empty chair. We'd like to start off by saying that we're going to be taking you on a voyage. I'll be taking you on a voyage of rediscovery, because there's a concept that says voyaging isn't just about seeing new landscapes, but it's about developing new eyes in the way of seeing things around you already. Another way to say that is to be able to reframe, to refocus, redefine the world as we see it, acknowledging that many of us are dealing with the challenges of the future from biases that have been planted within us from the past. This discussion today really builds upon schools of thought that borrow from and acknowledge that context shapes content, that the context of the past has created content that may not be applicable or appropriate for the new context in which we are moving into. It also asks us to consider the forms of and structures of the businesses, the education, the industries that we all subscribe to today, these thoughts, and that even in the challenge of creating new opportunities, our ideas are biased by the old contexts, the old forms, and the old structures. Raising the blue continent is about challenging that idea. Is about asking ourselves, is there a new way of thinking, and as a result, a new way of behaving? This concept says, let's shift our thinking from the continental thinking model to perhaps an island thinking model. And when you think about the Earth as an island rather than as a continent, this may have some value in our contemporary world and the world to come. As Polynesian navigators settled the Pacific, some say as early as 100 BC, compared to our European voyagers and discoverers who entered in the Pacific in the 16th century. In fact, I was studying up on Mr. Columbus there, and there was a statement that says when Columbus arrived in the Americas, he mistook them for India. It was about Columbus taking possession of a place. Well, interesting enough, that notion of taking possession, of ownership versus stewardship, kinship, the concept that is embedded in Polynesian and island thinking versus ownership. Following Columbus in the 16th century, we have the idea of the Balboa being credited with discovering the Pacific. Thank goodness for him, Polynesians now know where we live. Shortly thereafter, Magellan came into the Pacific, and he was credited with giving it a name, the Pacific. Again, thanks to Magellan, Polynesians now know what to call it. Previously, we just called it home. The idea that Europeans, these discoverers who were searching, looking, and perhaps even lost, were the ones that founded the principles and the decision screens that we operate from today boggles my mind. Instead of asking those who knew where they were, those that knew their places, and predicating the knowledge and the wisdom upon that, rather than those that were discovering, looking, and seeking. So is there a way then that we can go back? Because when they arrived, they also arrived with this notion of finders, keepers. And I think all of us grew up knowing the end of this statement. Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. And unfortunately, many of us have continued this tradition of trying to catch up, to fill in those things that we have lost, those things that we don't have. When in reality, there is so much that we have to offer, that the assets and the wisdom of ancient people in the Pacific could actually be the source of knowledge, wisdom for the future challenges that we all faced, not just in the Pacific, but on the planet island called Earth. And so this concept then begs the question, as Kamehameha, who was featured here in a canoe in 1877 when Captain Cook arrived, then the transition to the new global economy, as it is now, we are in a transition to a new global economy. In fact, in several months, leaders from 21 economies are going to descend here in Hawaii to discuss the future and the economics of our world in a new economy. We are on the cusp of change. Can Hawaii and places like the Pacific begin to influence that new view, that new lens into the way we see the world, our relationships with one another, and our resources, in the same way that we living in the Pacific have done for centuries? I believe it's true. I believe it's possible. When we begin to look at the world through an islander view, again, the island of Earth, not the continent of Earth, is that when we look at the island view, we realize that our resources come from the skies, the seas, and the land around us. That whatever we put on our canoes is what we have. That's what we rely on. It's not going to come from somewhere else. And these are the principles that we begin to challenge the previous thinking. As I think about this particular image, we all know this as the thinker. The concept that we were shared with or embedded, the idea is that I think, fill in the blank. I think, therefore I am. I was meeting with a Tongan leader one day, an elder, and he told me, he goes, Ramsay, our Polynesian ancestors think about this differently. It's a different view. Instead of I think, therefore I am, the concept is I belong, therefore I am. It means that I can be anywhere in the world. I may not know where I am, but I know where I belong. I belong to a people. I belong to a place. I belong to a culture. I belong to a principle of thought and behavior, which means that I'm always centered in self and avoiding being self-centered. And the idea that we are connected to one another, to the places around us, and our relationships to our resources, that sense of belonging versus a demand and a seek for belongings. This notion of belonging versus belongings, I'm finding that in many of the places that I get to share this information, this is the one thing that is common to all, regardless of their cultural backgrounds and their origins. People are seeking belonging at a time when we're probably more connected than we've ever been before. Why is that? Because somehow the processes and the biases by which we operate have somehow disconnected us from our places and one another. And more importantly, sometimes from ourselves at the deeper spiritual level. Raising the Blue Continent is really about acknowledging that the physical place, the Pacific, is not something that disconnects us, but actually connects us. In fact, our friends living on the west coast of California, I think they now understand that they are connected to their friends and family in Japan. The tsunami of recent time just reminded us that we are not disconnected by that ocean, but instead truly are connected. When you see the Pacific now as a continent, please acknowledge that in actuality, you're looking at close to 97 million square miles, over 21,000 miles of coastal region, resources, human and otherwise, that others are coming to exploit without talking to and engaging the stewards and the residents that live in and on this continent. By reframing the Blue Continent, the Pacific as the Blue Continent, it begins to suggest that Hawaii is in the center of the new economy, not on the fringe of the old economies of Wall Street or Asia. That we are in the center of it, again, not on the edge of it. As the 21 economies come to Hawaii, will we be able to engage? Will we be able to influence and inspire a new way of thinking, a new way of behaving? Because I've learned that continental thinkers have said for many, many years that we seek the enlightenment and the knowledge and wisdom of those that sit on mountaintops. Imagine, Hawaii, like most of the islands of the Pacific, represent the mountaintops and the mountain ranges that define our Blue Continent. And when they arrive here, that they will be inspired and enlightened by the knowledge and wisdom that is embedded in the people, their culture, and yes, even the land. Because the very name of this place describes those very things. The ha, the air, the spiritual, that which connects, the life-giving breath. It's the vai, the life-giving waters. that connects us all, that's in us all. It is the E, the spiritual creative energy that connects us, that allows me to recognize you before I know your name. It's that chicken skin that we get. This notion of Ha, Vai, E, the water, the air, the spirit of our relationships of people and place. When you come away from this place embedded in these thoughts and concepts, then the entire world becomes Ha, Vai, E. Wherever you are, we have a relationship to this mission statement of caring for the air, the water, and the spirit of our relationships with our friends, our families, as well as the resources. This is a very special place. Ha, Vai, E now becomes a mission statement. And this mission statement is even embedded deeper in our concepts and thoughts in the Pacific. This notion of Heva'a, Hemoku, Hemoku, Heva'a. The canoe is an island, and that island is a canoe. We take our resources from the environment around us in both. We rely on whatever's there for our sustenance. And if we don't, where else do we get it from? It's also embedded in the notion of Ikava Ma'amua, Kava Ma'hope. The future inspires the past, and the past is inspired by the future. This notion that we can take knowledge forward, and we don't have to go back, but that we can look to the future by understanding our past and learn from the wisdom of others who successfully lived in the middle of the sea for thousands of years before others arrived. It's looking at native wisdom and science that's embedded in the oral and oral traditions of those places, in the hula, the dances, the language. For instance, when you say ah, everyone say ah. Ah. You're calling upon that heat energy that's in the sun, in ahi, in the fire. Everyone say e. You're calling upon the water energy that's in the vai and the kai, the ili, the small stone that is worn down by water. And when you put these two energies together, the ah and the e, you get this concept of ai. Ai, it's water and fire, which creates steam. Steam is a form of energy. Energy is a form that we get from food. The Hawaiian word for food, the Hawaiian word to feed, the Hawaiian word to eat, it's all about energy. Now, how in the world do the Pacific-based people come up with the calculation for caloric exchange through two letters? Ai. Energy. It's all about energy. Food and energy. These are the two things that challenge us here in these islands. It's the two things that challenge us on the island called Earth. How do we feed ourselves? And how do we power our homes and our bodies? In our ancestral thinking, we are connected to this place. Father, mother, child, wakea, papa, and haloa. It's understanding this familiar relationship that when you eat from the place, you have an obligation to it. Hey Hawaii, I am Hawaii. Why? Because I eat it and she eats me. It's a reciprocity agreement that says we give and receive, we don't give and then take. These concepts of the blue continent really begin to say, at some point in time, the nested hierarchy of recognizing that our places have defined our cultures and our societies. And then our economies, the currencies of exchange, represent our relationship to our resources there in those places. We supplement what we don't have from elsewhere, but here in Hawaii, we now rely on 85% of our food coming from someplace else, and our fuel coming from someplace else. Somehow, the tables have been turned. We are no longer connected to our places, our societies, and our resources, but instead are being imposed upon by concepts and thoughts from elsewhere. How do we begin to reconnect before this thing falls apart? Or maybe it already has. We have the opportunity to get in front of this by looking at the cornerstone values of Ahupu and Moku management that were basically embedded in our ancestral ways and wisdom. This notion of reciprocity and aloha, caring for the place that feeds you, ma'ala ma'aina. Working together hand in hand, like on a canoe, all hands on deck, laulima. Everyone working together as one. Why? To establish the balance required in this notion of interconnectedness. Not being disconnected, but being connected, knowing that we all have to work together in a time when the resources are being challenged. How then do we go back to or subscribe to cultural values? Values are universal, but in our places, we prioritize them differently because of our relationship to those places and resources and one another. These values that we all know here in the islands, rediscovering that aloha is not just about greeting people. It's not about half full or about half empty. It's about knowing that the two faces of aloha says that you give in order to receive, because you're never a glass that is half full. But with aloha, you're always one. It is about leaving people whole, not wanting more. It is about creating better, not bitter. This is aloha, that overarching value that begins to drive this notion that when we care for the places that we live in, the places that feed us, it's not about carrying capacity as much as it is about carrying capacity. When we care as much about the future as we do about the present, we will adopt principles, practices, and behaviors that allow us to survive today, but also enhance the ability of future generations to do the same when they need to. This is the root of sustainability. This notion that the kuleana, that the rights and privileges that we want to enjoy are deeply embedded in the obligations that we have to this place and to one another. That we have to live up to those responsibilities in order to begin to enjoy the ability to stand each day with joy, to demonstrate with others what we can do for the future. This is the embedded understanding of kuleana. That the poi bowl represents the notion that we must feed all people, but we must also take care of the poi bowl. In the absence of the poi bowl, there's nothing. The holding environment no longer exists. We can no longer eat. So we eat today, but we always think about the empty chair tomorrow. These are the concepts that our ancestors have shared with us. And I borrow from a friend of mine who is a chief of the Yaqui tribe, a peace chief. They wanted to make him a war chief, but he says, we lost the war. We need to work for peace. And he says this, the wealth of a society is measured by the health and well-being of its children. And yet, we have communities today, communities of houseless, where the majority of them are children. How can we begin to pat ourselves on the back about success when our children are no longer laughing with glee, but worrying about where they get the next meal? Perhaps what we need to do then is reframe, redefine, and refocus the measures of success for those of us that live on this island called Earth. Maybe the answer is embedded in a different question. Whenever I went to my grandmother's house, she'd never ask me how I was doing. When I walked into the room, she'd always ask me, you hungry? You ate? You like food? And it doesn't matter how long I'd be there. At the end, she'd always ask me, you had enough? So maybe the answer is, have you eaten? Do we begin to ask the question, how many people have been fed? So what I like to suggest, it's not about thinking, but it's about acting. We don't think ourselves into new ways of acting, but act ourselves into new ways of thinking. We need to extend our net, cast it a little wider. We need action, not thinking. Because remember, we are all islanders living on an island suspended in the sea of space. We don't have to live a life that is half full or half empty. Like this glass, there's ha, the air in the upper, vai, the water in the bottom, and light, e, that is always traveling through it. We are always full in ha, vai, e. And with this knowledge, imagine what we can do when we raise the blue continent. Aloha.